Hope was gone, then humanity's war fleet arrived to save their allies. The smoke never stopped rising. Elder Counselor Sova Dren stood at the narrow window of the command shelter and watched the sky above Selim Prime burn. It was not the red sky of a sunset. It was the deep orange of a city on fire. 3 districts to the north, the Velhari capital's oldest tower had collapsed an hour ago. He had heard it fall even from this far away, a long, grinding roar that shook the walls of the shelter and sent dust raining down from the ceiling. No one in the room had spoken after that. They just looked at each other and then looked away. Sova was old. He had lived through droughts and famines and the slow political wars of the coalition chambers. He had buried a wife and 2 sons to illness. He thought he knew what loss felt like. He had been wrong. Nothing in his long life had prepared him for watching his world end in real time. The Drakal Dominion had arrived without warning 22 days ago. Their fleet had come out of deep space in a tight formation, broadcasting nothing, no demands, no declarations, just weapons fire. The first Velhari defense station had gone dark within 6 minutes of contact. The second had lasted a little longer, its crew fighting hard and dying hard, buying time that no one had been able to use. By the end of the first day, 3 of the 5 orbital stations were gone, and the Velhari fleet was scattered and broken, the surviving ships limping behind a debris field that offered some cover but no real hope. The ground war had started on day 4. Drakal troop carriers had descended through the smoke in tight columns, and the soldiers they dropped were unlike anything the Velhari militia had faced before. They were large, armored in thick black plating, and they moved through resistance the way water moves through cracks, simply going around anything solid and swallowing everything else. Cities in the southern continent had fallen in 48 hours. The northern industrial zones had held for a week before the reinforcements arrived and ended the fight there too. Sova had sent his requests for help on day 1. He had gone through proper channels, filling every form the Galactic Coalition Compact required, listing the attack, the casualties, the scale of the invasion. The replies had come back polite and empty. Coalition Speaker Mevra Lewin had expressed deep concern. The Torvani Federation had called for a special session of the chamber. The Sheln Republic had offered to send medical supplies, though no ship carrying such supplies ever actually left their ports. Everyone had something to say. No one had anything to do. On day 9, Sova had reached out directly to the Human Diplomatic Office. He had not done it through the coalition. He had sent a personal message to the human ambassador, laying out the situation plainly and without ceremony. The ambassador had replied within the hour, saying the message had been passed up the chain, and that decisions were being made. Sova had held on to that reply for 3 days before he stopped reading it. Now it was day 22. The 4th orbital station was gone. He had watched the feed when it happened, a flash on the sensor screen, and then silence where a station full of Velhari had been. The 5th station was still operational but barely, running on reserve power, its crew holding on by sheer will alone. The remaining Velhari ship sat behind the debris field with almost no ammunition and no realistic path through the Dominion formation. Militia commanders on the ground were sending reports of streets lost, neighborhoods cleared of civilians, resource depots captured and burned. Every report ended the same way, asking when help was coming, asking what they should do, asking if there was still a plan. Sova did not know how to answer them anymore. He turned from the window and walked slowly to the communications console at the center of the room. His aide, a young Velhari named Kale who had not slept properly in a week, was monitoring the frequencies with bloodshot eyes. Kale looked up when Sova approached, and the look on his face said everything, still nothing from the coalition, still nothing from anyone. Sova sat down. He pulled the open channel transmitter close and sat with it for a long moment, not sure what he wanted to say. There was no one listening that could help. He knew that. The Human Diplomatic Office had gone quiet after the 3rd day. The coalition chamber was still debating. The Torvani were still concerned. The Sheln were still preparing supplies that would never leave the dock. But he needed to say it. Not for strategy and not because it would change anything. He needed to say it because the Velhari were dying and at least the universe should hear that they had died asking for help, that they had not gone quietly, that they had reached out to every hand they could find. He activated the transmitter and spoke in measured, quiet words. He said that the Velhari people were under full invasion by the Drakal Dominion. He said that 22 days had passed and no ally had come. He said that the militia was still fighting but that they were running out of everything, ammunition, food, medical supplies, soldiers. He said that the orbital defense was nearly gone and that the cities were burning. He said that if anyone in the coalition had any intention of honoring the compact they had all signed, the time for intention was long past and what was needed now was action. He said it without anger and without begging. He simply said it, the way a person states a fact that needs to be on record somewhere. Then he said that if no help was coming, he understood. He said he was not angry. He said he was only tired, and that the Velhari were only tired, and that they would keep fighting until they could not anymore, and that they hoped whoever heard this signal would remember that the Velhari had been good allies who had kept every promise they ever made. He ended the transmission and sat back. The room was very quiet. Kale had his head down, pretending to study a screen that had nothing new on it. 2 militia officers near the back wall had turned away. One of them had his hand pressed flat against the wall as if he needed something solid to hold onto. Sova looked at the window again. The sky was still burning. He was trying to decide whether to send the last of the reserve militia into the northern quarter or to hold them for the shelter's defense when Kale suddenly sat straight up. His eyes went wide. He leaned toward his screen, then tapped rapidly on the sensor interface, pulling the data larger, checking it twice. "Counselor," Kale said. His voice was strange, not frightened, not exactly. "Something else." Sova turned. Kale pointed at the sensor feed from the outer edge of the system, the deep space corridor far beyond the Dominion's formation. The feed was showing mass signatures. Large ones. Many of them. Emerging from faster-than-light travel in close sequence, one after another after another. Sova stood. He moved to the screen and leaned in close. The signatures were not Velhari. They were not Drakal. They did not match any coalition profile he recognized by shape or size. But there were dozens of them, and they were big, and they were moving fast, not drifting the way exploration ships drifted, not holding position the way patrol vessels did. They were moving in formation. A combat formation. "Who is that?" Sova said quietly. Not a question exactly. More like something he was saying to steady himself while he waited to know. Kale ran the identification scan. It took several seconds. Then the result came back, and Kale read it once to himself, and then looked up at Sova with an expression that did not quite look like relief and did not quite look like disbelief but was somewhere between both. "Human," Kale said. "That is a human fleet." Sova stared at the screen. The signatures kept appearing, more ships dropping from FTL, one after another, spreading into a wide approach arc across the outer corridor. He had sent that transmission without expecting an answer. He had been wrong about that too. #hope was gone, then humanity's war fleet arrived to save their allies. Admiral Grace Calloway had not slept in 31 hours. She did not look it. She stood at the forward command station of the Ironhold with her hands folded behind her back and her eyes on the tactical display like someone studying a problem she had already half solved. Her uniform was pressed. Her posture was straight. Around her, the bridge crew worked in tight, focused silence, the kind of silence that forms naturally when people respect the person standing at the center of the room. The Ironhold was a carrier-class flagship, one of the largest combat vessels the human fleet had ever launched. It was not built for speed or elegance. It was built to survive anything thrown at it and keep throwing back. Behind it, spread across a wide approach formation, came the rest of the battle group, 16 destroyers, 9 railgun frigates, 3 troop carrier vessels already loaded with ground forces, and 2 support ships carrying enough ammunition and repair materials to sustain an extended engagement. It was not a peacekeeping detachment. It was not a diplomatic escort. It was the kind of fleet that made even large empires reconsider their choices. Commander Leon Hart crossed the bridge and stopped beside Calloway, holding a data tablet. He was younger than her by 15 years and had a way of delivering bad news calmly that she had always appreciated. "Dominion formation is holding in mid-orbit around Selim Prime," Hart said, pulling up the tactical overlay. "Roughly 240 ships. Combat configured. Their rear guard just picked up our FTL signatures. I am reading a change in formation posture on the outer picket line." "They are reacting," Calloway said. "Slowly," Hart said. "They did not expect company. Their main bombardment elements are still locked on the planet." Calloway studied the display. The Dominion formation was large but not elegant. It was a bullies arrangement, spread wide to overwhelm defensive positions, not structured to fight a coordinated strike from open space. She had seen this kind of formation before in historical records. It worked perfectly against civilizations that had no deep space response capability and no one willing to come fight in their corner. Against a human battle group moving in coordinated strike lanes, it had serious problems. "What did they send at us?" she asked. "A patrol wing," Hart said. 22 ships. Calloway said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Send the destroyer screen." Hart passed the order. The response from the Dominion patrol wing came back to the Ironhold sensors 4 minutes and 11 seconds later, in the form of silence. 22 Dominion ships were no longer registering on the display. Hart looked at the screen. "Patrol wing is gone." "I know," Calloway said. She had given the order to move the fleet the moment the Velhari distress signal had cleared human relay stations and reached her command center on Outpost Varan. She had not called a planning session. She had not waited for a coalition vote or a diplomatic clearance or a formal request through proper channels. She had listened to Elder Sova Dren's words, which had been transmitted in the open, unencrypted, clearly not written for an audience but for a record, and she had made a decision in about 40 seconds. The compact said allies came when called. The Velhari were calling. She was going. The coalition had tried to reach her 3 times during the FTL transit. She had let the calls record themselves. She would deal with the political consequences later, if there were any, and she was fairly certain there would not be, because the kind of people who complained about allies being rescued tended to go quiet when the cameras were on. On the other side of the Selam system, Drak-El Fleet Admiral Gervith received the sensor report of his patrol wing's destruction and did not panic. Gervith was experienced. He had taken 14 systems for the Dominion in his career. He had crushed the Velhari orbital defense with the calm precision of a soldier who had done this kind of work many times. He looked at the incoming human fleet's formation on his display and felt no fear, only a kind of mild professional curiosity. He knew very little about humans. The Dominion's intelligence files listed them as a coalition minor member, one of dozens of small, unremarkable species spread across the Midrim territories. They had no history of major military engagement with any significant power. They had never fought the Dominion. They had never fought anyone worth noting. That patrol wing had probably met some kind of trap, some prepared position, something the humans had staged to look impressive. He sent 2 heavy cruiser wings to intercept 44 ships. Then he turned back to the orbital bombardment schedule for Selam Prime's northern continent. There were still industrial sites the Dominion's engineers wanted intact, and he needed them cleared of Velhari defenders before the ground forces moved in. He did not watch what happened to the cruiser wings. On the Ironhold, Calloway watched the Dominion's second response appear on the tactical display and allowed herself a single quiet breath. Hart was already redirecting the frigate lines. "They thought the patrol wing was a fluke," Hart said. "They think we are a bluff," Calloway said. "Let the frigates answer." The railgun frigates moved to the front of the formation, fanning into a wide engagement line. At extreme range, further than most species calculated as an effective firing distance, they opened. The Dominion cruiser wings had not yet closed to their own weapons range when the first volley hit. The railgun projectiles did not need to be precise at that range. They needed to be consistent, and they were, landing in rapid sequence across the lead cruiser elements and stripping shields in under 2 minutes. Then the carrier wings launched. Lieutenant Petrovas was the first pilot out of the Ironhold's forward bays, and she took her squadron straight down the center of the gap between the 2 Dominion cruiser wings, flying fast and low relative to the plane of engagement, her targeting system feeding her a continuous stream of point defense positions to neutralize. The noise in her helmet was constant, her crew talking in short bursts, her wingmates calling positions, the occasional flat tone of a lock warning that she broke before it could complete. She punched through the center of the first cruiser wing's formation before they had time to close the lane. Behind her, the heavier strike elements came through the gap she had opened, hitting the cruiser flank from an angle the Dominion ships had no coverage for. Gervith finally looked up from his bombardment schedule when the damage reports started coming in. Not 1 or 2 ships. Not a skirmish. His cruiser wings were collapsing. He stood very still in front of his display and read the numbers with the expression of a man who had just discovered that he had fundamentally misunderstood something important. He had read the human species wrong. He had read the patrol wings' destruction as a lucky ambush. He had read the cruiser wings' engagement as a manageable setback. He was reading the full tactical picture now for the first time, and what it told him was that the humans had come in a full combat configuration with coordinated strike lanes and long-range suppression capability and carrier-based precision wings that were currently cutting apart his mid-formation with a level of organized aggression he had not seen from any coalition species in his entire career. He sent the recall order for his bombardment elements to reform into a defensive posture. It was the right move. It was also far too late to matter. Because Calloway had seen that defensive posture in the records of every civilization the Dominion had ever crushed, and she had already placed her destroyers exactly where it fell apart. She watched the display and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Hart, send the signal to the Velhari remnant fleet." Hart nodded and keyed the tight beam channel. Calloway leaned toward the transmitter. "Hold your position," she said, her voice even and unhurried. "We have them. Rest." On the damaged 5th orbital station, surrounded by the smell of burnt wiring and recycled air, a Velhari communications officer heard those words come through a speaker that had been sparking for 2 days. She sat very still. Then she pressed both hands flat over her face and did not move for a long time. Outside the station's cracked viewport, the human fleet was still coming. #Hope was gone. Then humanity's war fleet arrived to save their allies. The battle did not feel like a battle to the people watching from the surface. It felt like a storm. The kind of storm that arrives with a sound you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. Elder Counselor Sova Dren stood at the shelter window again, the same window where he had watched his world burn for 22 days, and looked up at a sky that was changing in ways he could not fully follow. The orbital sensor feeds told part of the story. The flashes of light at the edge of the atmosphere told another part. But neither thing captured what was actually happening up there in the black space above Selim Prime. What was happening was a systematic dismantling. Admiral Grace Calloway had divided the human fleet into 3 strike groups before the engagement began. She had done it without drama and without long speeches. She had looked at the Dominion formation on the tactical display, identified the 3 structural weaknesses in its shape, and assigned a group to each one. Left flank. Right flank. Center corridor. Each group knew its lane. Each group knew its job. They did not wait for each other and they did not stop to regroup. They moved the way a professional crew moves through a task they have rehearsed many times, quickly, smoothly, without wasted motion. The left flank strike group hit the Dominion supply and support vessels first. These ships were slower, more lightly armed, positioned at the rear of the formation because no one had ever punched through the front of a Dominion assault fleet fast enough to reach them. The human destroyers did it in under 12 minutes. The support vessels tried to scatter. Most did not make it far. The right flank group took the heavy combat elements, the Dominion's main capital ships, the ones with the thickest armor and the largest guns. These were the ships Gervith had counted on to be unstoppable. The railgun frigates worked on them from a distance, chipping away at shields with a patience that was almost methodical, landing round after round in the same sectors of each ship's defensive envelope until the shields there collapsed. When they did, the strike craft came in close and hit the exposed hull directly. It was not fast. It was not meant to be. It was meant to be thorough. The center group moved straight through the gap that Lieutenant Petra Voss and her squadron had opened in the second engagement, pushing deeper into the Dominion formation with every minute that passed. Voss herself was still out there, running her 4th pass through the mid-formation point defense network. Her fighter had taken a hit to the rear stabilizer on the 3rd pass, a glancing shot from a Dominion turret that had done cosmetic damage and made the ship shudder for about 3 seconds. She had corrected her flight path and kept going. "Lead, I have a lock on a cruiser-class command node," her wingmate called over the channel. "It is running a suppression signal, jamming the Velhari remnant fleet's communication lines." "Take it," Voss said. The cruiser command node was gone 20 seconds later. On the 5th orbital station, the communication systems came back online all at once, a sudden rush of channels that the crew had not heard clearly in days. The station commander, a weathered Velhari named Driva, sat up sharply at her console and began running through the active feeds. What she saw on the tactical overlay made her reach out and grip the edge of the console with both hands, not from fear but from sheer overwhelming relief. The Dominion formation was not just being pushed back. It was being taken apart piece by piece, section by section, with a precision that felt almost surgical. She had watched the Dominion fight before. She had watched them crush the first 4 stations with overwhelming force and no particular skill. They had simply had more ships and more firepower and had used all of it at once. They were not fighters. They were crushers. They found something smaller than themselves and they pressed until it stopped moving. The humans were fighters. There was a difference, and it was not small. Down on the surface, Sova received an updated sensor report from Kale and read it 3 times. He kept expecting the numbers to change back to something that made sense. The Dominion had come here with 240 warships. After 37 minutes of engagement with the human fleet, they had lost 61 of them. Another 40 were damaged and falling out of formation. And the human fleet had not stopped moving, it was still pushing forward, still tightening the 3-group formation around the Dominion's shrinking core, still methodical and still precise and still moving like it had all the time in the universe. Sova sat down slowly. "How?" he said. He did not say it to Kale. He was not really asking anyone. It was the kind of word a person says when the world stops making the sense it made before. Kale understood anyway. "They have fought wars before," he said quietly. "Real ones. Long ones. I have read some of the records in the Coalition Historical Archive. The humans have fought wars among themselves for most of their history. They are not new to this." Sova thought about that. He thought about all the coalition sessions where the human representatives had sat quietly at the edge of the chamber, speaking when spoken to, never pushing, never making demands, never acting as if they were anything more than one of dozens of small species trying to find their place in a large galaxy. He had never thought about what was underneath that quiet. He thought about it now. Up in the middle of the battle, Commander Leon Hart was tracking the Dominion's movements with the calm focus of someone doing math they were good at. He watched the right wing of the Dominion formation attempt the regrouping maneuver, a well-practiced rotation that pulled the capital ships into a tight defensive cluster while lighter vessels spread wide to create a shield layer. He had read about this maneuver in the Dominion's engagement records, which human intelligence had been quietly collecting for years. He knew exactly what it was. He knew exactly what it was trying to do. He also knew it required the maneuvering ships to pass through a specific corridor in order to form properly. He had put destroyers in that corridor 2 hours ago. "They are entering the corridor," Hart said. Calloway nodded once. The destroyers opened fire from point-blank range into the flanks of the maneuvering Dominion ships. The regrouping formation collapsed into chaos. Ships that had been moving with precision were suddenly cutting hard to avoid collisions, breaking formation, losing the coordination that made the maneuver work. Several tried to reverse course. They ran into the ships behind them. Gervith watched it happen from the Dominion flagship and said nothing. He had no words. He had built his entire career on the idea that the Dominion's strength was absolute, that once they committed to a campaign, the outcome was never in real doubt. The only variable was how long it took. He had not built any part of his thinking around the possibility of losing. He was building that part now, very fast, under circumstances that were not ideal for careful thinking. He gave the retreat order at the 51-minute mark. It did not go cleanly. A retreat order given to a formation that is already breaking is less an order and more a suggestion. Some ships jumped immediately. Others were too damaged to align their FTL drives. Others tried to cover the retreat of their damaged companions and got caught in the destroyer screens. The withdrawal was not a controlled movement. It was a scattering. Calloway watched it on the display and let it happen. She did not chase the retreating ships into open space. She had not come here to hunt a fleeing enemy across the galaxy. She had come here for the Velhari. "Secure the orbital corridor," she said. "Get the rescue teams moving toward the 5th station. And get me a ground situation report, I want to know what is still happening down there." Hart was already on it. The ground report came back in less than a minute, and it was not good. The Dominion's ground forces were still in the streets of Selim Prime, still fighting, still holding large portions of the capital. The orbital battle was decided. The ground war was not. Calloway looked at the troop carriers sitting in formation behind the iron hold, 3 ships, fully loaded, engines warm, waiting. "Tell Monroe to go," she said. The troop carriers were already moving before Hart finished passing the order. #Hope was gone, then humanity's war fleet arrived to save their allies. The landers came down through smoke. There was no clean approach. The sky above Selim Prime's capital was thick with the residue of 3 weeks of fires, and the descent path was rough, shaking the troop carriers hard enough to rattle the equipment racks and send loose gear sliding across the floors. Captain Dex Monroe sat strapped into his command seat near the front of the lead carrier and watched the altitude reading drop on the small screen beside his head. He had made combat landings before, Twice on Earth during training simulations, once for real on a contested moon in a conflict that most coalition members had chosen not to notice. He knew what a rough drop felt like. This one qualified. Around him, his soldiers sat in their harnesses without talking. Some had their eyes closed. Most were just still, the way soldiers get still in the last minutes before a landing, not calm exactly, but very focused, all the nervous energy compressed into something tight and controlled and ready to release the moment the ramp went down. Monroe keyed his command channel. Ground report from Velhari Command. The reply came from the shelter, Counselor Sova's aide, Kale, who had been handling communication coordination with a steadiness that Monroe had noted and respected. Kale gave him 3 grid references, areas of the capital where Velhari militia was in active contact with Dominion ground forces, where the lines were thinnest, where reinforcement would matter most. Monroe listened, made his marks, and fed the 2 most critical coordinates to his squad leaders. "We are not waiting for ideal conditions," Monroe said over the all-unit channel. "The Velhari are still in contact on the ground. We go in hot and we link up fast. Stay in your lanes and keep your squad leader in earshot." No one said anything back. They did not need to. The lead lander hit the ground hard in the middle of a wide intersection 3 blocks from the capital's administrative quarter. The ramp went down before the dust settled. Monroe was the 4th person off, and by the time his boots hit the cracked stone of the street, the first 2 squads were already moving to either side, clearing sight lines, taking positions behind the remains of a collapsed market stall and the burned-out shell of a ground vehicle. The sound of weapons fire was close. Not in this street, 2 streets over, maybe 3, the distinct crackle of Dominion energy weapons cutting the air at regular intervals, and underneath it the lower, slower sound of Velhari militia rifles firing back. The Dominion weapons sounded confident. The Velhari weapons sounded tired. Monroe moved his unit north, keeping to the cover of the building line. The streets were empty of civilians, they had either evacuated deep into shelter zones or were hiding inside the structures, which meant every corner had to be approached carefully. His point squad moved fast and low, checking angles, and Monroe stayed just behind the lead element where he could see what they saw and make calls quickly. They found the Velhari militia 2 streets up, a unit of perhaps 30 soldiers holding a barricade made of vehicle wreckage and broken construction materials, dug in across the mouth of a wide avenue. They were holding the line, but barely. Half of them had visible injuries. Several were sharing ammunition from the same packs. Their commander, a Velhari named Oren Veth, was crouched behind the central barricade with his rifle up, calling adjustments to his soldiers in short clipped phrases. He heard Monroe's unit coming and spun around fast, weapon raised. Monroe held up his hand, open palm, and stepped forward. "Velhari militia, we are human forces, here to support your position. Lower your weapons." Veth stared at him for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then he looked at the humans spreading out behind Monroe, the armor, the weapons, the movement pattern of trained soldiers who had just arrived and were already setting up coverage angles without being told to. He lowered his rifle. "You are real," Veth said. He said it the way a person says something they expected to be a hallucination. "We are real," Monroe said. "What is your status?" Veth gave him the picture fast and clearly, a quality Monroe appreciated in any officer, alien or otherwise. Dominion heavy infantry were pushing from the north end of the avenue in rotating assault cycles, pulling back and pushing again to wear the militia down. The militia had been repelling each cycle but losing a few meters with every one. There was a Dominion armor unit, 3 heavy ground vehicles, sitting 1 block further north and providing fire support for the infantry. The militia had nothing that could touch the armor. Monroe turned to Sergeant Lena Briggs, who was already studying the avenue from a covered position beside the barricade. Briggs was one of the best tactical readers Monroe had in his command. She saw how ground fights worked the way some people saw shapes in clouds, quickly and without having to think hard about it. "North corner, left side," Briggs said before Monroe could ask. "If we push 2 squads up the building line on the left, they can get angle on that armor position from the side. The infantry between us and the armor will have to turn to respond, and when they do, we push the center hard." Monroe nodded. "Do it." Briggs moved. She took 2 squads up the left building line at a run, using windows and doorways and the cover of a long concrete overhang that ran above the first floor of the block. The Dominion infantry on the avenue did not see them until the squads were already in position. The engagement that followed was short. The armor vehicles, hit from an angle they had not been covering, tried to rotate. Briggs' squads did not give them the time. When the Dominion infantry turned to respond to the flanking threat, Monroe pushed the center straight up the avenue with the remaining squads and what was left of Veth's militia at the same time. The Dominion line broke in the middle first, then both sides, and what had been a solid blocking position became a running disorganized retreat inside of 4 minutes. Veth stood in the middle of the avenue afterward and looked at the result with an expression Monroe could not fully read. It was somewhere between relief and disbelief and something that might have been the beginning of tears, quickly controlled. "You fight very fast," Veth said. "We had good target information," Monroe said. He clapped Veth once on the shoulder, carefully. Monroe was aware that humans were physically different from Velhari in ways that required some adjustment in how they interacted, and he did not want to knock the men over. "Can your unit keep pace if we push further north?" Veth straightened. His unit was battered and tired and had been fighting without relief for 3 weeks. He looked back at them, the injured ones, the exhausted ones, the ones sharing ammunition because there was nothing else to share. Every one of them was looking at him. Every one of them was still holding their weapon. "Yes," Veth said. They pushed north. The fighting went on for 4 more hours. Monroe coordinated with the other lander elements over the command channel, pushing the Dominion ground forces back from the capital's center block by block, street by street, using the same approach every time, Briggs finding the angle, the squads moving through it, the Velhari militia holding the ground that was taken. It was not clean. It was not easy. 2 of Monroe's soldiers were injured before the first hour was up. Several Velhari from Veth's unit fell in the 3rd hour's fighting in a narrow street where the Dominion had set up a second armor position that took longer to deal with. But they kept moving. At the 5th hour, Monroe received word that the last Dominion ground forces in the southern half of the capital were requesting terms. The northern units followed 20 minutes later. The retreat order had come down from what remained of the Dominion command structure, and without orbital support and without a line to hold, the ground troops had nothing left to fight for. Monroe brought his unit back toward the command shelter zone as the city began to go quiet for the first time in 3 weeks. Elder Sova Dren came out of the shelter when the fighting stopped. He stood on the steps and watched the street, the mixed columns of human soldiers and Velhari militia moving past, the human rescue teams already moving through cleared areas checking for survivors, the engineers working fast to stabilize a building 2 blocks away that was in danger of coming down. A young human soldier stopped near him, maybe 20 years old, still in full armor, carrying a medical kit. She was checking a Velhari civilian who had come out of a collapsed doorway. She spoke to the civilian in careful, simple words, gesturing to show what she was doing, moving slowly so as not to alarm them. Sova watched her work. She had come from across the galaxy for people she had never met. She was doing her job with the same focused care she would have given to one of her own. He did not know how to hold all of that in one thought. He stood on the steps and tried anyway, and the city that had been burning for 22 days began, slowly and painfully in one street at a time, to go quiet around him. #hope was gone, then humanity's war fleet arrived to save their allies. The silence was the strangest part. Elder Counselor Sova Dren had lived with the sound of the war for so long that its absence felt wrong, like a presence rather than a lack. In those first hours after the fighting stopped, he kept waiting for another explosion, another alert, another set of reports that he would have to read and respond to in some way that would make no difference. But the reports that came now were different. They were quiet reports, recovery reports, numbers of survivors found rather than numbers lost. Each one was small, but each one was real. The human rescue teams had spread out through the capital the moment the ground was clear. They worked fast and without ceremony, cutting through debris, carrying survivors on stretchers, setting up field medical points at street corners and in cleared building lobbies. They did not wait to be asked and they did not wait to be directed. They simply looked at what needed doing and did it, the same way they had looked at the battle and done that. Sova spent most of the first day after the fighting moving through what remained of the capital, accompanied by 2 of his aides and a human escort that Monroe had assigned without Sova requesting one. He walked through streets he had known his whole life and did not recognize them. Some blocks were almost untouched. Others were so damaged that he could not tell where the buildings had been. The people coming out of hiding were quiet and slow-moving, blinking at the daylight the way people look when they have been underground for a long time. Many of them stopped when they saw the human soldiers working nearby. They stared with the same expression Sova kept seeing everywhere, the expression that had no name because it was made of too many things at once. On the second day, Commander Leon Hart came down from the Iron Hold to oversee the fleet's recovery operations in person. He and Sova met at the steps of the command shelter in the late afternoon, when the light was flat and gray and the air still carried the smell of old smoke. Hart was a careful man, Sova had read that in him from their first exchange. He chose his words deliberately, and he listened more than he spoke, which Sova had always considered a mark of someone worth talking to. They walked together without a fixed destination, and Sova asked the question that had been sitting in him since the moment the human fleet appeared on the sensor feed. "What do your people want in return?" Sova said. He kept his voice level. He was not asking as a transaction, he was asking because it seemed important to understand clearly, so there would be no misunderstanding later between the Velhari and the humans about what had been given and what was owed. Hart thought about it for a moment. He did not give the quick answer of a politician or the evasive answer of a diplomat. He gave the considered answer of a soldier who was also, at his core, a straightforward person. "We want the Velhari to rebuild," Hart said. "We want you to be strong again. We want your people to know that what happened here does not mean the galaxy abandoned them, because not all of it did." He paused. "And we want you to answer the call if we ever need the same." Sova looked at him for a long moment. "That is all." "That is all," Hart said. Sova walked beside him in silence for a while. He was thinking about the coalition chamber, the debates, the sessions, the careful language designed to mean several things at once while committing to none of them. He had spent years in those chambers. He had believed in what they were supposed to represent. He still did, in some deep part of himself. But he also understood now, with a clarity that 3 weeks of invasion had burned permanently into him, that a compact was only worth the character of the species that signed it. On the third day, Admiral Calloway attended the coalition emergency session by remote relay from the Iron Hold. Sova joined the session from the shelter's communication room, sitting at the same console where he had sent his final broadcast into the silence 8 days ago. The session was already in progress when his feed connected. He could hear the formal language of the opening proceedings before his screen resolved into the chamber view. Coalition speaker Mevra Lewin was already speaking. She was a tall Torvani with carefully arranged robes and a voice built for chambers, full and formal and carrying the practiced tone of someone accustomed to setting the terms of conversations. She was describing the human fleet's engagement as an unauthorized intervention, a unilateral military action that bypassed coalition protocols and set a dangerous precedent for member species acting outside the framework of the compact's deliberative process. It was a good speech. Sova recognized the quality of it even as he recognized what it was, the speech of a person redefining events in a way that made inaction sound like principle. Calloway waited until Mevra Lewin finished. Then she spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not match the formal register of the chamber. She spoke the way she apparently always spoke, plainly and with purpose. She read the compact. Not all of it, but the relevant sections, the language around mutual defense obligations, the clear conditions that triggered those obligations, the timeline of the Velhari invasion, and the timeline of coalition response. She read the dates carefully. She noted which species had taken action and which had not. She did not call any species a coward. She did not accuse anyone of treachery. She simply placed the facts beside the language of the compact and let both things be present in the chamber at the same time. When she was done, she said, "The Velhari called for help. We came. If that precedent troubles any member of this body, I would suggest the trouble is not with what we did." The chamber was quiet. Mevra Lewin attempted a reply, something about process, something about the risks of unauthorized escalation. Sova watched the other delegates in the background of the chamber feed. Some of them were not looking at Mevra Lewin. Some of them were looking at their own hands. The Sheln delegate had turned slightly away from the central viewpoint, as if finding something to study in the middle distance. The session produced no resolutions. There were no formal votes, no declarations. It simply ended, the way some things end, not with any clear conclusion but with a quiet that says everything that needs to be said. Sova closed the feed and sat for a while in the communication room. The shelter around him was less full than it had been. People were slowly beginning to move out, back toward their homes or what remained of them, beginning the first careful steps of a return to something like normal life. Through the wall he could hear voices, Velhari and human mixed together, coordinating something that had to do with clearing a collapsed structure 2 streets over. The voices did not need translators. They were using gesture and repetition and patience, and from the sound of it, it was working. He went outside in the late afternoon and found the clearing near the eastern edge of the shelter zone, a flat open space that had been a market before the invasion. The market was gone. But the ground was still there, and in the middle of it a young human soldier was crouched down next to a Velhari child, helping the child carry salvaged supplies from a collapsed structure nearby. The soldier was not doing it efficiently. She was letting the child set the pace, letting the child pick which things to carry, making small sounds of encouragement when the child successfully moved something heavy. The child was very small and very serious and working with tremendous concentration. The soldier matched that seriousness without mocking it, treating the task as the important thing it clearly was to the child. Sova watched them for a long time. He was already thinking about the account he would write, the official Velhari record of what had happened here, which would go into the coalition archive and stand for as long as the archive stood. He was thinking about how to describe the 22 days and the silence from the chamber and the feeling of watching hope go out, and then the feeling of watching it come back in the form of something he had not expected and could not fully account for. He thought he would end the account with something simple. Not with the battle or the politics or the fleet. With this, a clearing in a broken city, a child carrying something heavy, a soldier from a species that had traveled across the galaxy to help people it had never met, crouched in the dust and making sure the child knew the work they were doing together mattered. He thought that was the part that explained the rest of it. That on the day hope was gone, humanity did not ask whether it was worth the cost. They simply came.